Hi everyone, Stepan here. In this video I'm going to cover the Richter-Veresov attack. Okay, so the Richter-Veresov is a system opening basically, and the first upside I'm going to mention is that people don't know it very well, so nobody is going to be expecting it basically, as opposed to the London system or d4, c4 or other more mainstream systems or openings for white. The Veresov is uncommon. It's even less common than the Jobava London system. The difference is only that the bishop is on g5, not on f4. Now that makes it an interesting option for all sorts of tournament players and online as well. So let's talk about the opening. First, let's talk about the downsides of the opening. Well, as you know, the main advantage for white, after d4 is that in most lines he can either gain central space with c4 or with e4, depending on what black does. So one of these two moves should give white the biggest possible opening advantage. You control the center, you have a lot of space, and so on. As soon as you play knight c3 on move 2, regardless of what black does, either d5 or knight to f6, you've made a concession. The concession is pretty clear. You cannot move your c-pawn, you cannot bolster, you cannot reinforce your center in the event of black trying to break it. This is what makes the Veresov quite risky, as well as many other openings, such as the Jobava London system, such as some variations of the French, like for example, let's put this on the board. So if you go e4, black plays the French. As soon as you play knight to c3, trying to go into all of those very interesting lines that Bobby Fischer and other players used to play, against c5 you don't have the move c3. It's basically the same idea here, the same downside here. After knight f6, if you play knight to c3, you can never reinforce your center, and equally important, you cannot break black's center. So that's the main downside of the opening. The main upside is that after d4, most players with black are not going to be expecting you to play such a clear-cut strategy as the one you get in the Veresov. We are going to get to that in a second. Now let's talk about when you can play the Veresov and when you shouldn't play the Veresov. You can still try, but you shouldn't. The Veresov only really works against the knight on f6. If there is no knight on f6, the Veresov doesn't work. Why is that? Well, once you play knight to c3, your next move is going to be bishop to g5. That's the Veresov attack, or the Richter-Veresov. You want to play these three moves: d4, knight c3, bishop g5. Bishop g5 is a double purpose move. The first idea is to reinforce e4, and that's going to be your main idea in the opening. So same or similar to what you do in the Spanish when you play bishop to b5, you're trying to get rid of the knight on c6 so that you can play d4. It's a very similar idea here. So you want to play bishop g5, get rid of this knight, play e4. Okay, so that's one idea. The second idea is by playing knight to c3 and bishop to g5, you're threatening two different things. The first one is, if black does nothing, you can take on f6, cause structural damage. Once you cause structural damage, black is going to have to deal with that for the rest of the game. The second one is, since you've moved your bishop out to g5 and your knight to c3, you have a threat of bishop g5, you have a threat of e4, but you have a third threat as well. Or the third idea, it's to simply move your queen away either to d3, to d2, to f3, or to h5, castle queenside quickly, and start an attack. So with these three moves, you have three main ideas: play e4, double the f-pawns, move the queen away, and castle. As you can see, with knight c3, bishop g5, and d4, you are two moves away from castling queenside, which you don't get in many other openings. Now let's talk about the starting position. So knight f6, knight to c3. Okay, what is the threat here? The threat is e4. If black does nothing, if black doesn't play the move d5, you should play e4. So for example, if your opponent plays the Pirc and the King's Indian, let's say, or if against d4 his main weapon is the king's Indian and he plays pawn to d6, there is no better move than e4. So my advice to you is don't play the Veresov unless you are prepared to capitalize on black's mistake of playing d6 going into the Pirc, and unless you're willing to play pawn to e4. Because if you don't play pawn to e4 in this position, you are simply going to be slightly worse, and that's another downside of the Veresov. For those of you who care about engine evaluations, unless you play the principled moves when you have the chance, you are going to be slightly worse. Okay, so after e4 we are in the Pirc defense, and you have to have something prepared for this. My advice for tournament players, and this is mainly why I've been studying the Veresov and I have it in reserve, is I want to play it against a specific type of player, against somebody who doesn't play the Pirc against e4. So for example, a Sicilian player or a French player or a Caro-Kann player, but someone who plays the king's Indian against d4. So they may not be as familiar with the Pirc if you play e4, or they definitely won't be as familiar as you, and you can also get them out of their main king's Indian stuff with d4. So after d4, knight f6, knight to c3, black really should play d5, which is our starting position. He has to prevent e4, and now you go bishop to g5. Now, before we get into the Veresov, just one more thing. Against 1 d5, you shouldn't play this. If you play knight c3 here, some players with black are going to play knight f6. I am one of them. I'm not afraid to face the Veresov with black, so I'm going to play knight f6 because those are the setups I know best. However, if black plays any other sensible move, like bishop f5 or c6 or e6 or even g6 or c5, you cannot play the Veresov because there is no knight on f6. So if e6 is played, for example, you sort of have to go into the French with pawn to e4. You can also try playing the Jobava London system, but you basically have to transpose. So smart players with black are going to delay knight f6, and they're not going to be playing it on move 2, therefore not allowing you to play what you want to play. Okay, now, the Veresov. As we said, we have three main ideas. The first one, which you don't have to go for, even though you're going to have a choice more often than not, is doubling the f-pawns. The second one is playing for e4, which as soon as you can play it, you should play it. The third one is get the queen out and castle. You are 2 moves away from doing that. Now, what can black do? Black has 7 different viable options against the Veresov. Let's start with the least popular ones. So he can go h6, he can go g6, he can go c5, he can go e6, he can go c6, he can go bishop f5 and knight b to d7. All of these options you should know something about, but we are going to be dividing them into 2 groups to make it easier to understand. The first group is going to be the options that prevent bishop f6. Those would be knight b to d7, which is the main line, and pawn to e6. Of course, you're not going to take on f6 if black can recapture with the queen. So that's the first group. The second group are the moves that allow bishop takes f6. So all of these, and bishop f5. In my opinion, if you are given the opportunity to play a slow positional game in which you have a slight edge, you should go for it. Again, the engines are going to say that black is slightly better in almost all the lines, but if you can double black's f-pawns, I would advise you to do that. Which brings me to my next point. If we have a look at this position, e4, c6, we have the Caro-Kann, takes, and knight to f6. This is a very common line which either leads to the Bronstein-Larsen or the Korchnoi. Let's imagine white taking, which is the main move. And let's say e takes. You can also play g takes. This position is, funnily enough, what you're going to be aiming for in the Veresov. So if you decide to take on f6 and double black's f-pawns, you are going to be trying to enter the Caro-Kann, either Bronsted-Larsen or the Korchnoi, but with one difference, and a big difference, you still haven't played e4. So the structure is going to be like this, but there's going to be a pawn on d5, and there's either going to be a pawn on e2 or on e3. So your main idea is going to be to trade off the e pawn for the d pawn and get this exact position. So let's have a look at that. For example, if black plays bishop to f5 here, just for example, you take, you go, I don't know, e3, c6, bishop d3, takes, knight bd7, e4, takes. This is the same pawn structure. If we have a look at this position and this position, it's the same thing. So very often, if you decide to take on f6, you're going to be entering the Caro-Kann, but you still have to play e4. Okay, that's very important. The other thing is, with the knight on c3, with the bishop on g5, as soon as you play e4, if you are allowed to play e4, you're going to be entering some sort of French. The most obvious example is this position. After pawn to e6, which is one of the 7 main responses, if you play e4, which is the best move, you are now in the French defense, burn variation, and this is a very mainline position with thousands of games. There are more than 15,000 master games, from this position. And there are many moves black would play here. d4, bishop b4, bishop to e7 are the 3 main moves. And I would advise you to watch my video on the burn variation of the French, just to make it easier for you. At least you have to be aware that you're entering this. Okay, now, most players with black who know what they're doing are going to try to transpose to something they know from the Veresov attack. So French players are going to play e6 here. Caro-Kann players are going to play something that allows you to take, and they're going to play c6. Okay, many Grunfeld and King's Indian players are going to try to break with c5 and try to get a position they are slightly comfortable with, or g6, bishop g7, and c5. So people are going to try transposing. Okay, now let's get into the theory. The first move we are going to be looking at is pawn to h6. We are starting with the group of moves that allow you to take on f6. If black plays h6, this is a simple attempt to grab the bishop pair and, well, cause you to waste time, because if you take on f6, then you will have wasted 2 moves with your bishop. It's possible to play bishop h4, but after e6 and e4, I don't know who this French is good for. I would prefer to have the black pieces here, especially if I'm an experienced French player. So you get a sort of winnower variation with the bishop on h4. I don't really know what to think about that. In any case, if black is a French player, then he's going to be enjoying this position a lot. So the main move, and main move for a reason, is to grab this pawn. G takes f6 after h6 should be pretty bad, because the h6 pawn is weak. The pawn is actually much safer on h7. So whenever black plays h6, you can expect e takes f6. And now we are in our Caro-Kann sort of territory. It's possible to play e4 straight away, but e3 should be better. You can go for e4 later and c6. And as I said, as soon as we trade these 2 pawns, we are in the Bronsted-Larsen or the Korchnoi, depending on which pawn black takes with. Now, whenever you exchange on f6, it's not really that easy to start an attack. So moves like queen d3 or queen d2 or queen f3 or queen h5 are possible, and you can go for those sorts of ideas, but it's much more sensible to play it slowly. Now with the move c6, and this is a move we are going to be facing a lot in the Veresov, black does 2 things. The first thing is black reinforces the pawn on d5, but that's less important. More importantly, it gives the queen an option to go to either b6 or to a5, and this could cause a lot of trouble, especially in conjunction with bishop to b4 and c5, which means that if you decide to castle queenside, for example, queen f3, bishop to b4, knight e2, try to reinforce your knight, black castles, let's say we keep attacking with g4, black could try to cause issues with queen a5 and c5. Or instead of bishop to b4, black could simply try queen to b6, where now if you castle queenside, which should be the most principled move, then c5 comes straight away. Well, not hanging your d-pawn, but or maybe a5, and black is the one attacking first. So in positions where you have taken on f6, where you've gotten rid of your bishop, where black has this clump of pawns which defends the king and has the option to play bishop d6 and queen b6 and queen a5, you should play the position slowly. So after h6 you take and simply continue developing. Now black could develop, black could try f5 blunting your bishop. As we said, we want to play e4, so f5 is a sensible option. But let's say bishop to d6. In this position, it's possible to play a normal move like knight f3, which is something I would advise you to do. But again, the second kind of plan in the Veresov is to start attacking. So let's have a look at both. If you play knight f3 and black castles, and you castle, then f5, preventing e4, blunting your bishop. One of the common ideas is to move the knight away. And this is a pattern you're going to have to learn, either knight b1 or knight e2. And the reason is twofold. Firstly, your knight isn't doing anything on c3 unless you can play e4. And secondly, you want to reinforce your center in the event of c5 coming. So one thing to remember, one pattern to remember, if you've doubled black's pawns and black plays f5, your pawn break is going to be c4. Okay, so if black plays f5, you should play for c4 almost always. To do that, of course, you have to move your knight away. For example, knight e2, let's say black develops and b3 c4 is a very common idea. You can also reinforce that further with knight to d2, but that's just something you have to remember. If, for example, g6, simply defending the pawn, then b3, knight to d7, c4, and this is what we are trying to achieve. We cannot play e4, therefore we play c4. We try to either get a broad center if black takes, or we try to isolate the d5 pawn and play against that. And with two weaknesses, if for example black does nothing, takes, with these structural weaknesses we should have a long-term advantage. So my advice to you would be, in these positions after h6, just go for a slow plan of bishop to d3. It is possible to play queen f3 and start attacking. So if black obliges, for example, bishop to d6, let's say bishop to d3 and castles, it is possible to start a mad attack straight away. For example, knight d7, h4, I don't know, queen b6, castles, let's find the move, I don't know, a5, and you start pushing. This is possible. You're always going to be slightly worse, and if black finds the correct moves, black is going to be better, but makes the game more fun. And instead of playing slowly for structural weaknesses, you're playing aggressively and trying to end the game. Okay, the second move I would like to look at is again a move that allows bishop takes f6, and that's pawn to g6. Okay, now here you can again choose between a structural weakness and the kingside attack. This is going to be very, very similar to the Jobava London system. So if you haven't seen my video on the Jobava London system or my series on the Jobava London, I would invite you to do so. So the two options are bishop f6 or moving your queen and starting an attack. Moving the queen away to d3, as we are going to see is the case in some other lines, isn't really that smart here, because the bishop is going to g7. You would like to trade it off and also there's a pawn on g6, so your queen is sort of blunted and running into bishop f5, therefore queen d2. In most other lines, queen d3 is going to be most useful to prevent bishop f5. So here with the pawn on g6, that makes no sense. So queen d2 is the main move, and after bishop to g7, it's actually, you can choose between several options, but they're all going to be similar to the Jobava London. Imagine the bishop on f4, it's the same thing. You can play bishop h6, you can play castles queenside, or you can start with f3. You can also play h4, but that should be less precise. In order to prevent any nonsense with h6, blunting your attack, bishop h6 is the main move. And after white castles, we now have basically a transposition to the Jobava London. You can reach this position from both openings. Takes, king takes. You continue your attack with castles queenside, and this is a very typical position which has occurred many times and can actually come from several different openings. What black should do is punish white for not being able to support the center. What white should do is checkmate, or try to checkmate. So black continues c5, for example, e3, knight c6. Now here you could play f3, you could play something like bishop b5, but dc5 should be the best move. And after queen a5, black is going to get his pawn back, most probably. And d5 is weak, but I would rather be black, to be honest. I think this is a very scary position, and they've played it several times in the Jobava London, and they almost never did well. So that's one option. After g6, play queen d2, play for an exchange of dark squared bishops, and for a kingside attack. But be aware that after c5, black has a ton of counterplay. The other option, which I like way more, is bishop takes and e takes. And now again we are transposing to the Caro-Kann type position, where black has recaptured with the e-pawn. It's just not useful to have a pawn on g6, and as you know, in most lines in the Caro-Kann, black wants to play knight d7, knight f8 to defend the h7 pawn, and wants to push h5, h4. And very often this knight from b8 is going to end up on g6, supporting an attack. So in my opinion, as a Caro-Kann player who's been playing knight f6 and taking with the e-pawn in the classical, a pawn on g6 is a hindrance which I don't want to deal with, and I don't have the same type of position. So here after e3, c6, I think this is a good position for white. I think the pawn on g6 is actually favorable for white. Again, we continue bishop d3. If f5, remember your plan. You want to move this knight away and prepare c4. So for example, knight f3 developing, knight to d7, castles, bishop to d6, knight to e2, castles, and now c4. And we break this position. Black, of course, should not allow you to isolate his d-pawn, so takes and bishop takes. And now, well, the endgames should be slightly better for you. Not that you have a large advantage, because you have two holes, e4 and d5, and once this knight comes to f6, maybe black is slightly better. Again, I'm used to playing positions like this from the exchange Caro-Kann, and I'm used to positions with bishop f5 and exchanging bishops and white doubling my f-pawn, so I know how useful a pawn on f5 can be. So I prefer black here. But if you manage to trade the pieces off, the endgame should be better for you. Okay, so against g6, you can choose between two different options. I would advise you to take on f6 and try to play this position around the pawn on f5. Maybe with f3 later on, but just remember that as soon as f5 is played, you need to move this knight away and play c4. Okay, the next option is pawn to c5, and this may seem like the most aggressive option, but trust me, it's the easiest one to play against. And after c5, trying to punish you straight away, again, you could continue e3, but you're going to be slightly worse. Whatever happens, you could also play knight f3, but again, you're going to be slightly worse. You can play e4. Again, you're going to be slightly worse. You don't want to take, really. So let's stick to the main idea. Again, this is in the group of moves which allows bishop f6, so we are going to go for bishop f6. Okay, now ef6 I think should be slightly better for white in this position, because black has already committed, so you don't have a Caro-Kann pawn structure, and after e3, knight c6, knight g2, for example bishop e6, you can simply go for g3 and try to play this like a reversed Panov attack, or my brain is not working, I forgot the name of the opening. In any case, reverse Panov for white has a name, but I can't remember it. You want to put pressure on d5, so that's this I think is a simple enough plan. After gf6 though, the d5 pawn can be reinforced, which is why most people take with the g pawn. So again, after c5, bishop f6, ef6 allows simple pressure on d5. gf6, while the d5 pawn can be defended, simply leaves black with a weak king. So after e3 and knight to c6, which is the most common move, we can start the attack straight away. It's possible to take on c5, it's possible to continue developing with knight f3, you can play bishop b5, French defense style, trying to put pressure on the knight. You can play knight g2. There are several fine moves, and none of them really make the position much better or much worse for either side. But there is one move which stands out and which makes this a very interesting variation, which is why I think playing against c5 is extremely easy. And that move is queen to h5. Now, queen h5 is very scary to meet. Black has two options. Black can play e6, trying to develop, or he can try to win a pawn. If cd4, then ed4. If you turn on the engine here, it says minus 0.1, and after here it says +1, so the pawn cannot be taken because white simply gets too rapid development. Okay, so after queen h5, cd4 is possible, but the pawn cannot be taken twice, and you're going to castle queenside anyway, so it doesn't really make too much sense. e6 is a more promising option, and after castles queenside, cd, ed, one thing that's clear to me is that if I were playing black, I would be afraid to castle either side. I'm down in development, basically. I'm one move down in development. I have a weakness on the king side, so if I castle queen side, my f7 pawn is going to be extremely weak. If I castle king side, then I probably get mated after a simple bishop d3 and g4. So most players continue bishop d7, and after something like knight g2, they continue f5, trying to reinforce the center. And the engine thinks black is better here. The engine thinks it's minus 0.5, but it thinks that in almost all the lines of the Veresov. Again, for the Caro-Kann player, this is going to be easy to understand. This is an exchange Caro-Kann after h3 and bishop f5, and an exchange of light squared bishops. It's just that the bishops are still on the board. However, if you're not playing a Caro-Kann player who is experienced with having a pawn on f5, this is going to be simpler for white. White is going to be wasting a lot of time thinking where to put his king. Okay, so this is what I think you should go for after c5. And I think this should work out for white. Again, you're not playing an opening which gives white an optimal advantage. You're always going to be slightly worse, so it's the case here as well. Okay. The next move I want to look at is the one that transposes to the French, and that's pawn to e6, and we are not going to be wasting almost any time on that. So we are talking about knight f6, knight c3, d5, bishop g5, e6. Now, if you play e4, you're in the French defense. If you play knight f3, you're slightly worse. So my advice is, unless you are willing to enter the burn variation, don't play the Veresov, because if you play knight f3 and, for example, bishop e7, e3, knight bd7. Let's just play some normal moves. Bishop d3. White is always slightly worse. Black is going to play for c5 and have a very, very simple plan of b6, bishop b7, playing for e5. Any player who plays the semi-Slav is going to enjoy this position a lot. And since you have to waste time on knight e2, and since if you play e4, this bishop becomes a monster, black is always comfortable. So again, play e4, enter the French. So if you wonder how to enter this position via e4, it's e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, knight to f6, and bishop to g5. And you are now in the burn variation. Okay, now let's have a look at the next move. So e6, you're going to be entering the French. c6, another move that allows you to take on f6. However, c6 is not as useful as e6 because it doesn't help white's development. It also doesn't force the bishop to move like h6. So you have a couple of options. So you don't have to take. You can go with e3 or you can play queen to d3. Now it all depends on what you want to do. My preferred way of playing is taking and going for the Caro-Kann structure I was talking about. The most aggressive option is queen to d3, and the most passive option is e3, which I wouldn't recommend you to do. After e3, we can enter the main lines with knight b to d7. This actually reinforces the knight and still keeps control over e4. So that should be the best option for black in my opinion. But black could also go for queen b6, and this, as I said, can be a weakness that's easy to target. As soon as you move your bishop away, which we know from the London, from the Jobava, from the Veresov, from many openings where you move your bishop away, your queenside can be weak, especially your b2 pawn. So queen b6 is an option to exploit that immediately, where you are forced to play rook b1. Now, as soon as we play rook b1, we cannot castle queenside anymore, and we should be slightly worse, especially after something like bishop f5, c5, knight c6, maybe knight b4, pressure here, you cannot move your pawn away. This, I think, should be avoided. It should be only slightly worse for white, but I think it should be avoided. So after c6, e3 is, I think you shouldn't play it. You play the Veresov for one of two things, doubled f pawns or a kingside attack. So either queen d3 or bishop f6. If queen d3, black should continue knight bd7, reinforcing the knight, and there are two options here. One of them is to play e4, since you have the chance the queen has supported e4. Again, it should be better for black, but it's very tricky for black to play, I think. So if I had this position on the board, I would go for this. This is transposed to the main lines, and we are going to get back to that. The main lines are what happens, or almost transposed, are what happens after knight bd7. So let's look at e4. After e4, d4, knight e4, knight e4, queen e4. Black, of course, doesn't play knight f6 because you could take it. Black plays queen a5, attacking your bishop, so you are forced to bishop d2. And after queen b6, you are now forced to castle because you don't want to play rook b1. Now, if black manages to develop, if black manages to avoid all the pressure which you can try and cause, then black is going to be slightly better with the nice Caro-Kann pawn structure. So for example, if knight f6 and let's say queen e1 and bishop f5 and I don't know, knight f3 and e6, this is a very, very common Caro-Kann in which black is much, much better. There's pressure on c2, a5 is coming easily, c5 could come, knight d5 could come because it's quite scary to play c4. I would always prefer to be black here, but I'm very much subjective because I like the Caro-Kann. Queen d3, however, is the most aggressive option against c6. So if you are willing to do that, if you want a double-edged game, by all means go ahead. The best option, and the main move, or one of the main moves, is bishop takes f6, which I think you should play. Again, gf6 is possible, but ef6 should be slightly better. And now pawn to e3. bishop to d6, bishop to d3. And now if black castles, you have two options. I think it's actually better for black to play something like f5 and wait for you to commit, because it's very hard to find a move for white. If black waits with f5, well, waits, improves his position, f5 is not a bad move, it prevents e4. It also gives the knight this maneuver, which is very important. And if white plays knight to e2 here or knight to f3, he has taken away a very interesting option from himself. So after bishop d3, I don't think black should castle. If black castles, you now have, and I'm going to show you this in a bit more depth, one of the main attacking patterns in the Veresov, once you've played bishop d3, and black has castled, and you haven't moved your g1 knight, and that's queen to f3. Now you don't have to play queen f3, you can again play knight f3, you can play knight e2, you can play several different ideas, but queen f3 is very interesting, and it's actually not easy to meet. The idea is you didn't want to play bishop to queen to h5 because g6 comes with tempo, but it's also nice having your queen on f3 because it could get behind your g and h pawns. So let's look at some sample variations. For example, rook e8. Okay, you develop your knight after your queen has moved, so that's important. Let's say knight d7 developing, and now you can start the attack two different ways. You can play h4, but g4 should be more precise. Let's say knight f8 defending, Caro-Kann style, h4, queen to d7, trying to grab your pawn, rook g1, and this already seems very scary. If I'm black, I'm playing something like b5, and I want to start a counterattack. I don't think defending has any clear purpose. Whoa, excuse me. I don't think defending has any clear purpose here, because you already have a hook on f6, and you're either going to be forced to play f5 after g5, or you're going to take and open up some lines. So b5 makes most sense. White should castle, and this is probably a type of position you should study if you plan to play the Veresov, and this is probably the type of position you need to be comfortable with if you plan to play the Veresov. This is what I think you should aim for. If you can get both the structural weakness and the kingside attack, then that's ideal. Okay, now let's look at the two main moves. The first one we're going to be looking at is bishop f5. Now, this I think is one of the most common moves, if not the most common move online, even though it's not the main line. The main line is knight bd7. The reason people play bishop f5 is because the main line with knight bd7, which prevents bishop f6 and prevents e4, blocks in the bishop. So people play f5 to be able to play knight bd7 afterwards. So if you play, I don't know, if you play e3, for example, then knight bd7 is a normal move, or e6 and then knight bd7. If you play f3, which is one of the main lines, then you can play knight bd7. Again, this sort of justifies bishop f5. And we're going to have a look at some interesting lines. But after bishop f5, again, I'm of the opinion that you should be taking on f6 because you were given the opportunity to do so. The main idea behind the Veresov is to cause structural damage, so you should do it. So we are going to look at the alternatives, but let's look at bishop f6 first. After bishop f6, it's possible to take either way, but e6 is by far the most popular option. And now e3, c6, and bishop d3. After bishop d3, black could play bishop g6, which you don't have to take. But black can also take, which is more popular. Black can also defend with queen d7, but that sort of makes the knight awkward. So I don't really like this for black. I prefer simply taking. And now something like bishop b4, knight e2, castles, castles, rook e8. Okay, now what we talked about is the pawn break with c4, which you could go for even though black hasn't played f5 here. It's obviously not easy to play f5 with the light squared bishops traded off, but c4 is still a viable option. You can also go for e4. Now, in my opinion, if you're not an e4 player, playing e4 would bring you into a type of position you wouldn't like, or you don't like. So after e4, d4, knight e4, something like f5, and knight to d2, and maybe g6. The lines are open, the e-file is shared, there's probably going to be a liquidation. Again, if you are an e4 player, by all means go for this. That's going to be kind of a typical Caro-Kann. But a plan for players who would like to avoid e4 openings should be the c4 break. And this is why I think bishop f5 is not really the best option. After the bishops have been traded off, it becomes harder to play f5. Therefore, it becomes much harder to put the knight on e4. Therefore, e4 is still an option. But preparing all of that with c4 makes black's position pretty loose. So let's have a look at that. You don't have knight e2 here, otherwise knight e2 would probably be the best move. But you can go knight b1. And this knight is going to be supporting e4. It could also jump out to f3, but it's also going to be supporting c4. So now, for example, knight d7. You could play c3, but that's not the point of this. If c3, for example, bishop f8, knight d2, I don't know, g6, you should still go for c4. So c3 is sort of just chases the bishop away to a better square. I think after g6, bishop g7, this bishop is fine. So b3 is the idea, and playing c4. After g6, c4, again, black shouldn't allow cd, so dc. bc, let's say bishop f8, let's say queen to b3, targeting the weakness on b7. You now have a very broad center. You've isolated your a pawn, but I think this is much easier for white to play. This knight is now going to be rerouted back to c3 after the pawn has moved. And then you have rook b1 ideas, you have a4, a5, a6 ideas, and you're switching to a queenside plan. You want to play on the queen side. So in these lines with bishop f5, what I think is very important is to cause the damage straight away, try to trade off the bishops, and try to reroute this knight. Try to reroute this knight to play c4. If you can do that, you should have a comfortable position. I'm not saying it's much better for white or anything, but plan-wise, I think it's easier to play for you. Okay, now let's finally have a look at the main move. The main move is knight bd7. Now, this move has a clear advantage over all the other moves. It simply prevents you to play bishop takes f6, or it doesn't prevent you, it would make bishop f6 kind of absurd. The downside of knight bd7 is that this bishop is now a bad piece until something is done with these superfluous knights. Both of these knights would like to be on f6. So we have a couple of options. Knight f3 is the tamest one, which I would advise you not to play. If you want to play the Veresov, playing knight f3 is kind of, I mean, it's the main line. So if you play the Veresov, this has over 1,000 games in it. It's by far the most popular option. It is, however, not tricky for black to face, I think. There are a couple of options here for black. Black could go g6 or h6. Chasing the bishop away with h6 now that the knight has been supported is actually a good idea. So after h6, you go bishop h4, and black plays e6. We are now given the option to enter a Rubinstein French. And if you play e4, which should be the best move, then d4 is a Rubinstein French. Knight e4, bishop e7. This I've actually played in my last tournament game, this exact position. Let me show you how we can get it on the board. So we go e4, e6, d4, d5, knight d2. It's also possible to enter it via knight c3, but this is how I enter it. d, knight e, knight to d7, knight to f3, knight gf6. Bishop g5 is the sideline which I chose that tournament. h6, bishop h4 and bishop e7. We have the same position. We entered it via an e4 move order. So again, if you're willing to play the French, by all means go for that. So if black plays h6, after knight f3 you play bishop h4, black plays e6, you should play e4, entering the Rubinstein French. Again, if you don't know it, you can watch my video on the Rubinstein French. I know it, so I would have no issue going into this. If you want to avoid it, you have to play e3 and concede to being slightly worse, which is why, coming back to the original position in the main line after knight bd7, unless you're willing to transpose to the French, don't play knight f3 or e3. It just doesn't make sense. You're going to enter a French which A, you don't know pretty well, and B, your opponent does, or you're not going to... I mean, just don't do it. If you don't want to play the French, don't play knight f3. Okay, the two options which I would recommend, one of them is very risky, and that's f3, and the other one is queen to d3. They both have very clear plans. Queen d3 leads to queenside castles and an attack. f3 prepares e4. Now let's go through f3 first, because this is one variation which is always better for black. I think white is struggling to equalize after pawn to f3. So f3 again seems better for black in all lines. There are several ways for black to play. Black can play h6, c6, or c5. I think c5 is the trickiest to face, but let's look at c6 first. So if you played f3, you have to play e4. So e4, black should take this and break with e5. Now, this seems like white's position is simply crumbling. This again, you should probably take. So d takes, and now queen a5. And it seems... If you play e takes f6, I'll show you that. Then queen takes g5, of course. But what else do you do? If you play bishop takes f6, then g takes f6. And the main move here is actually e6, giving up a pawn. But I think black is better here. I mean, fine, it should be equal if you both play it correctly, or it shouldn't be a winning advantage, but black should always be slightly better. So after f3, even a tame move like c6 could cause you a lot of grief, because it gives the queen the option to play out to a5. If black plays h6, then you have to retreat to h4, and now black can either play c6 or c5, so c5. And again, you played f3, so you have to play e4, e4, d4, fe4, and again, black is going to target your weakness once the c-pawn has moved. And again, this is an unfavorable e4 opening, in my opinion, for white. Your pieces are all strange. b2 is undefended. What's the bishop doing on h4? It's not threatening anything. Your kingside is completely undeveloped. Your king is unsafe on e1. Everything seems to be working out for black. And after c5, which is the main move, again, e4 is the follow-up to f3. This is just without h6 inserted. Black could actually play d4 or cd4. If cd4, then you could play queen d4, but bishop f6 should be more precise, simply to make sure there are no queen a5 tricks later on. Knight f6, queen takes d4, d takes e4, and now you can play it French style with bishop b5, or you can take on d8. I honestly don't know which is better. Again, I would prefer to be black. If you play queen d8, king d8, castles on king c7, this king is actually pretty safe, and after fe4, you have an isolated pawn on e4. There is no way that with the bishop pair and with a better pawn structure, black is playing for anything less than a win here. Of course, it could still be a draw, white could win, but black is better. And yeah. And after c5, e4, if d4, then fe4 and queen a5, and again black should be better. Again, you need to avoid these tricks, so bishop f6, giving up the bishop pair for nothing. You can take with the knight, but taking with the pawn is actually even more promising. And now, let's say we develop knight f3, cd4, queen d4, bishop c5. You can see, okay, ef is an important move because it opens up the bishop, but you can see that black's pieces are more active. So, in my opinion, in the main line, playing f3 is a very risky option, and again, you shouldn't do it. Again, knight f3, French defense, your choice. f3, very risky. If you study on all the lines and look at all the tactics, and if black has no idea what he's doing, yes, you're going to have an interesting game. You can push e4, e5 against players who aren't careful, and things could go your way. But anybody who knows what they're doing is going to punish you, which is why I would advise you to play the move queen d3. Okay, queen d3 is interesting, and this I think should be considered the main line, because even though knight f3 has the most games, queen d3 is the main idea. There are a couple of ways for black to play. Black can play h6, black can play c6, black can play e6, black can play c5. One of these four moves is going to happen. I don't think there are any other viable options. Let's look at h6 first. Let me just tell you. Okay, g6 can also be played, by the way. I'm sorry. So h6 is the most common line, and black actually scores 46% on master level. White scores 13%. Now that's because on master level, and this is the only piece of data I wanted to give you, on master level, people understand how to punish the pawn being on c2. After knight b to d7, e4 isn't happening easily, bishop f6 doesn't cause damage, so black keeps all the advantages, and with h6 simply forces the bishop to move again. Bishop h4, now c6, again, this bishop now no longer has an option to drop back to c1 or to d2, so the queen has the option to go to a5 or to b6. You continue developing knight f3, and now queen a5. Now there's a clear threat. Black wants to play knight e4, and since you cannot support that with the bishop, that would cause you structural damage. So for example, if you play e3, then knight e4. And after something like bishop e2, then knight takes. And this, of course, we can see is fine for black. Of course, this pawn is going to be traded off for this one at some point, but still, you're going to be left with an isolated a pawn. So after queen to a5, you actually have to defend straight away, so we have to play knight to d2, which is why I think black scores better after h6. It's possible to play e6 or e5. I think e5 is the best move. You can also play queen b6, which I think is tricky because it forces white to castle queenside, but it shouldn't be best. You can play e5 now, but I would say e5 straight away is the best because the queen remains on a5, which is the most active square. Now the line goes bishop f6, knight f6, and d5, actually sacrificing a pawn moment, for the moment, but you have knight g4, and you're going to recapture back with the knight. So after h3, knight takes. Now we have a look at this position. Black has the bishop pair. It's not clear whose king is safer, but one thing is clear. These two knights seem pretty strange. So if the best move here is queen e3, and it is, and if it runs into d4, which it does, and after queen takes bishop e7, preparing to castle and play over d8, then this position shouldn't be played by white unless it can be avoided, unless it cannot be avoided. So lines with queen d3, you're going to have to accept that if black knows theory, you're going to have uncomfortable positions. That being said, if you play lower rated players, that's a good idea because you are going to outplay them. In a tournament game, if you're 2200 and you're facing somebody 1800, there's a high chance A, they're not going to be familiar with this, or B, even if they are, you're going to outplay them. The advantages that the engine gives are plus or minus 0.5, 0.6 or something like that. It's nothing terrible. Okay, instead of h6, if c6 is played without inserting h6, then e4 should be best. Entering a weird Caro-Kann, sort of, with the bishop on g5. So you play e4, d4, knight e4, knight e4, queen e4. And again, we've seen this line before with bishop to d2. The bishop has to retreat. c6 just gives the queen the option to go to a5, and you need to cover the check with d2. If e6 is played, this is slightly more favorable for white, I think, because the queen doesn't have an easy way out just yet. So again, e4, going into a sort of French, d takes, knight takes, bishop e7. We're in the French defense by transposition. So knight takes f6, knight takes f6, or bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, knight takes f6. This should be a normal position, which any French or e4 player is going to be comfortable with. Not that white has an advantage, but that's what you get. You want to castle queenside here, of course, and develop your pieces. Usually, it's good to have a bishop here to be able to play queen e2 and then castle, because that gives you the option to play knight f3, knight e5, knight f7 if black tries to develop his bishop. So that's something to bear in mind in positions like this. But this is still okay. You have the queen transfers after you castle queenside. I mean, it should be equal. I think I'd prefer to be white, because I'm the one with more attacking chances, and it's obvious that this bishop is not going to be aiming at my king if I castle queenside. Okay, and finally, c5. Again, against c5, you should continue with e4. One of the main ideas behind queen d3 is to play e4, of course, so you play e4. Now, cd4, bishop f6, if dc, then bishop c, of course, so knight f6, and queen d4, d4. Now, you're going to get that pawn back, most likely. But I don't think white is playing for an advantage here, and after something like bishop b5, bishop d7, bishop d7, queen d7, queen d7, king d7, trying to hold on to the pawn, it should be about equal. I mean, especially if you take this pawn back, which you are going to do, it should be about equal. So the truth about the Veresov, in my opinion, is that if black plays the main line with knight bd7, you don't really have an optimal move here. So f3, very tricky. Queen d3, if black knows what he's doing, should lead to a comfortable equality for black. Knight f3, either you go into the French playing for an advantage, or you accept that you're slightly worse. So all the other lines are fine. All the other 6 moves, I think, are fine for white. Against knight bd7, you need to study one of these 3. It depends on what type of player you are. You need to study one of these 3 in depth and figure out your own way to play the position for an advantage. Okay, thank you guys for watching. I'm going to be continuing the d4 series soon. We have a couple of more openings to cover, and then we are moving on to the English. Thanks again. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.